Hello, everyone. This is Aran, and I'm an educator of philosophy. I'm based in Austin, Texas. Here, I will have a conversation with my great friend, Trent. Hello, Trent.
Hi everybody, this is Chen, your friend. I'm a cultural historian for early medieval Europe and late medieval China. Great to be with you all today.
Yeah, so we are continuing our discussion on evolutionary psychology that we started a few episodes ago. Just a very quick summary of what we have talked about so far. We were talking about the book called Adaptive Mind, which is like a foundational text in evolutionary psychology, an anthology of papers on both theoretical and practical aspects of evolutionary psychology. Our main focus is on the article called Psychological Foundation of Culture by John Tooby and Lydia Kosmides that kind of lays the ground for the rest of the project, not just the book. What we have talked about so far is kind of a sketching the basic tendencies in evolutionary psychology and what they were trying to grasp, their general attitude towards the concept of human nature, and perhaps more importantly, what they define their approach to be against. Like, what is it that evolutionary psychology is trying to fix, and what is the kind of the source of that intellectual problem? And that intellectual problem lies not only about how we frame the concept of human nature, but how we think about the relationship between nature as biology and culture, right? And the main kind of thought that evolutionary psychologists want to go against is the what they call the standard social science model, which according to them has some very problematic assumptions about humanity that makes it unreliable in studying human beings. And of course, it makes their understanding of human nature also problematic. Now, the standard social science model that they are interested in actually is very selective in like which aspect of social sciences they want to think about. And they're thinking about Durkheim, they're thinking Gertz, and they're potentially thinking about people like Judith Butler that kind of like disregard the impact of the quote unquote biologically given or the people who think about culture as a sui generis structure with its own logic and think about cultural analysis as something that is kind of left to cultural anthropologists, perhaps philosophers, maybe sociologists, but definitely not natural scientists. So, in that model, nature just gives some basic features to us, the rest happens in culture. That, of course, impacts the way that we think about human nature or reject human nature. If you have been with us in our other episodes, we have talked about evolutionary biologists or philosophers of biology that are very skeptical about the concept of human nature. But the same skepticism could come from cultural anthropologists that think that there is some sort of a relativity of cultures that really evades some form of pan-human universal consideration of what we are as a species. This decoupling is the main source of the problem for evolutionary psychologists, however, because they think that um, cultural anthropologists, sociologists, and some philosophers that identify with the standard model, they have a pathologically wrong conception of the biological. For instance, they sometimes think about the biological as the traits given at birth, whereas we know that very important elements of biology are like time capsules that will just go off at different times of an organism's development, right? These developmental programs have different starting points, but that doesn't make them less biological. Just because growth of teeth happens later in life, that doesn't mean that it was caused by culture. It just means that the time capsule wasn't functioning at the time of birth. We the standard social science model advocates may agree with the evolution psychologists on teeth, but what becomes a matter of contention is that for evolution psychologists, mating choices, for instance, it also follows the same logic, right? Just because mating choices go up later in life, it doesn't mean that they're culturally relative. It just means just like teeth, they just unfold at different times. Right? And this idea of decoupling also causes the trouble of lack of conceptual integration and transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary consistency. The social scientists of the that are targeted here, they cannot envision any sort of court of appeals. So what they say is just what they say. They cannot really go back and see whether their analysis of a culture makes any sense. But evolution psychologists want to say that's a problem. If you want to understand culture, and there are psychological mechanisms developed in this, developed as adaptations for Homo sapiens, then we can have a court of appeals. Then we can overcome this kind of like hearsay and just like random interpretive endeavors that happens within the boundaries of social sciences. So the idea that brain and evolution and the natural features of us is just like this kind of a content-free container of culture or just something that makes culture possible is not enough. The psychological mechanisms cannot just be these general tendencies because we need them to give us constraints enough to frame the world in the first place. An example, and then I will stop and see what Trent has in mind. That means we are not just like this kind of a blank, malleable blank slate, and just like, let's say, language is just something that is imposed on us on this kind of like, just like put on this kind of a blank slate as something that is written culturally. We wouldn't have been able to learn any language if we hadn't these kind of psychological mechanisms to constrain our vision or framing of the world or point of reference or choosing what matters and why it matters. All that baggage is something that is we need to even start to learn a language, and it doesn't fade away and it doesn't stop at language acquisition only. So for evolution psychologists, this understanding of biology slash natural scientific naturally scientific objects of inquiry as something that are irrelevant to delineating what a human being is are fundamentally misguided and in some ways dangerous. Right?
Yes, I really enjoyed listening to your summarized tour de force. I think one thing I will add is at the end of the day, this is a very ambitious project. They're trying to provide a way to make cultural interpretation part of like a rigorous, normal scientific knowledge, and so the cacophony what they observe now does not match the standard we observe in, say, engineering or like the quantum mechanics. So they're trying to fix it by visioning a place where cultural interpretation fit into this hierarchy of knowledge. And I think that this episode we're going to talk about the exact model they're providing, namely integrated causal model. So will you take us there, please?
Yes. So the model that they are kind of like offering as the alternative to the standard model of social sciences, we have already mentioned the basics of it. Now it's just kind of like putting things together, right? So first of all, their point is that the point of evolutionary psychologists is that the human mind has like evolved information processing mechanisms. And these mechanisms are adaptations produced by natural selection over evolutionary time in ancestral environments, right? So when we have a human mind is not a blank slate that is ready to be just impressed by culture. It is actually consists of a set of evolved information processing mechanisms, include framing, connecting, disregarding all of those are just like information process mechanisms. And then information process mechanisms are adaptations. They're not just random things that pop up or random things that are granted to us. They are there because they're adaptations, and adaptations mean that the the subgroup of Homo sapiens that had these characteristics and were able to genetically transmit them to others are the ones that survive. That's basically what it is. And these kind of like establishments of these patterns happened in ancestral environments, hunter-gatherer societies, and we're basically in that kind of a space. Um, Another very important thing is that these mechanisms are not just generic, like capacity for so and so. They are functionally specialized, produce behavior that solve particular adaptive problems. It could be the problem of mate selection, language acquisition, how to build family relations, how to navigate cooperation within a complex social space, right? So it's not that like we are just thrown at the world to kind of use Heidegger's term, right? That we are thrown at the world in this kind of a baffled, kind of an alien entity, and just like suddenly you're just like within that culture we're having some questions to ask, and we just try to answer those questions, and go about our lives. In fact, we are very much ready. We are born ready. Let's think about it that way. And we are born ready in very specialized ways. We are born ready to identify danger. We are born ready to identify mates. And when we say born, we should go back to that initial point that we're not born, meaning that it's not that these behaviors are observable in infants. It is we're born with that kind of timed programs that are going to unfold in these kind of special contexts. So this context-specific information processing mechanisms, they create certain behaviors, artifacts, and linguistically transmittable representations as well. And the rest of the cultural content that we see in human societies are either expressions of these psychological mechanisms, or they're always kind of like in relation to these psychological mechanisms, and the specific type of like expressions of it is dependent on all sorts of like where the psychological machine is located ecologically, economically, demographically, environmentally in general, but the mechanism itself is just there, right? So these mechanisms are pan-human, and they are based on evolutionary biology, and they can account for variability as variability of different manifestations or expressions, but they can also kind of like make sense of the universality of human nature, which is about having these evolved information processing mechanisms. And it is with this idea that we can guarantee the conceptual consistency between natural and social sciences, because there shouldn't be any sort of like dualism between biological and non-biological. Biological is always there, right? Anything that is quote unquote non-biological, maybe as a cultural manifestation, is itself kind of only meaningful in the context of how it kind of pertains to the biological. This is not an endorsement of, let's say, gene determinism, evolutionary psychologists want to remind us, but it is to say that there is something about this consistency that matters a lot. That there is this kind of consistency between biological and non biological, that is not, that doesn't lend itself to the dualism that exists in the cultural anthropologists that they attack, like Gertz. That while biology ends at this point, then non-biology starts. It's all biology. It's all mechanisms developed because of biology. And it could have different manifestations in different cultures, but the basic point doesn't change. Right?
Yes. love what you said. I think what I'll do here is to provide a different, how to say, um, digestive framework to process these 4 or 5 points on the stage. I think what unify them is to see very intuitively the way they're providing alternative way to think about a culture, and those designs that clearly have existing research method in natural science as a blueprint. So that's how they synthesize it too. Let's take them one by one. First is the first two. I think they're doing a function-based deconstruction of culture. That instead of treating culture as a unified whole, we can identify specific compartment of it, let's say language acquisition, mating strategy, and see how that specific mechanism come to be. So that's very much against the cultural anthropology, specific strand of cultural anthropology. You must understand how the whole becomes rationalized and self-referential, but it fits very well with at least a layman's understanding of how natural scientists work. You have like biology that takes care of an animal and like behavior ecosystem. You have chemistry looks at a certain level of thermodynamic and exchange of energy or change of quality, and you have like a physics that it takes up at a certain level. So divide and rule. If cultural interpretation wants to become a normal science, specialization and figure out a universal way of cutting or division of labor to assign specific task of interpretation to specific specialists. If you're a mating specialist, you do that. If you're a language person, you do that. The second one I think really interesting here is they propose, especially the third and fourth point, third point is content specific and information process. And that's they're using information somehow as the universal translator of cultural phenomena symbols into something that is very congruent with biological systems. Like if you look at a cell has a information process, a processing system which detects the change in, say, temperature as well as the pH value in the environment. So it once you take or turn social interpretation um, culture text into the ground category of information, then of course we can find a common ground between like the science of life and the science of art. And finally is how history is given value in their analysis of human behavior. That is, they emphasize ancestral landscape or environment. Um, Ancestral were individuals who were before us, historical, and it connected to us through like blood or cultural evolution. And that's why historical analysis of certain specific landscapes, say East Africa savanna landscape, will be very important for us to understand who we are because that's our common region, or we still carry with us, we modern industrialized or whatever, still carry with us a set of mechanism which evolved in response to the environmental pressures that are in that specific condition. So we the universal the human universals that are not just concrete, not just substantive, not just functional, but also historical has historical shared historical root. Therefore, which is very much congruent, I think, with a lot of say astrophysics. Like we can identify the formation of the cosmos because we all have the Big Bang, stuff like that. So I think this is a very powerful typology of the specific features of this model, and within each specific model, they are already trying very hard to integrate knowledge derived from natural science with those from social sciences. But in my eyes, there's a clear hierarchy there that they're really conforming cultural methodology of social and cultural interpretation towards established natural scientific ones, not the other way around. Yes.
Yes, and I think there's something that's very interesting there. There are two things that can come to my mind, and then we should
Yeah, move on.
move on to different sides. It's like first of all, like this kind of information. The concept of information is going to be important when we start talking about our criticism of this enterprise. But I think it's interesting that it's kind of like the way that information processing mechanisms is framed in evolutionary psychology is that the mechanism itself is, for our purposes, absolutely inflexible, right? Like maybe in a million years things change, but like it's just so stable that it doesn't make any sense to not think of it as something that is fixed. Meaning that, like, I just want to kind of bring this forward that no content changes the information processing mechanism, right? It's not that like this specific mating scenario suddenly changes the information processes of how mating should work, right? I think it's a very important kind of like noticing that is significant. And secondly, very briefly, I think it's just interesting that because of this, as you mentioned, like the hunter-gatherer societies have a specific like relevance for this study. So it's interesting that I think evolutionary psychologists would be very much interested in like you know ethnographic work of a hunter-gatherer society. So they're not just like thinking that go read biology. No, actually, like kind of a behavioral analysis of hunter-gatherer societies that in one way or another exist in the world, or historical analysis of it, like physical anthropology and like all sorts of like areas that are invited into that inquiry. So when we think about this kind of a conceptual consistency and this kind of a unity of knowledge, definitely evolutionary psychologists are not thinking that okay, you either go like study neuroscience or you're just like saying nothing, right? And that itself is going to be interesting in the way that we're going to frame their reductionism and how that reductionism could be criticized on both sides. But I just wanted to make this point clear. Good. So I think we want to talk about like three things here till the end of this episode, in the sense of like both the consequence of these initial ideas for three important concepts and how they frame the concepts, whichever one you want to go, that's fine. But these concepts are culture, environment, and learning. And this framework has like consequences for understanding these. Now, when it comes to culture, which like the table that you see is directly um, from the text itself, the most important thing here is that like we have like this kind of three elements there, and the probably the most important element is the metaculture, the concept of metaculture that is the equivalent of those kind of like expressions of those psychological mechanisms. So the way that they describe it is mechanisms functionally organized to use cross-cultural legalities in social and non-social environment give rise to pan-human mental content and organization, right? So this metaculture is something that we can never escape, right? If you're human, you're part of the metaculture, and that's very important. Now, when we talk about evoked culture, we think about alternative, functionally organized, domain-specific mechanisms that are triggered by local circumstances. This leads to within-group similarities and between-group differences. So these evoked cultures are sometimes direct result of the psychological mechanisms, meaning that to remember that one of the things that the evolutionary psychologists are trying to do is that differences exist. That the evolutionary psychologists are not denying that there differences exist. They want to tell us why the differences exist. And one way to think about like these kind of in-group similarities between group differences is to think about it as a very direct impact of these psychological mechanisms. For instance, maybe we have psychological mechanisms that make us extremely tribal and protective of our gene cousins, as opposed to other groups. So us having a tribal identity versus another tribe and having our own rituals versus them and defining ourselves versus them is not a refutation of the pan-human mechanisms. It is the proof of it, right? We are creating these kind of even absurd ritualistic differences to differentiation between our gene pool versus another gene pool, which is a very basic psychological mechanism. We want our team to move on, right? Also, sometimes this is not just about this kind of like tribalism as an expression of certain psychological mechanisms, but just it's this because of that specific environment, right? We're going to talk about this later on, but like how the relevance of the status is evoked in a hunter-gatherer society is going to be different from 21st century American culture, right? Because of that kind of different um, localities. Uh, but uh, but that's not a refutation of of that difference. And this also kind of explains the epidemiological culture as well. And they think about that layer as observers' inferential mechanisms constructing representations similar to those present in others. Domain-specific mechanisms influence which representation is spread through a population easily and which do not. So this again is just another kind of like strategy to make sense of those differences without like losing track of the metaculture, right? Like the fact that these representation is spread through a population versus the other ones um, are definitely dependent on certain things in that space, but they're all in one way or another expressions of that metaculture, right? Uh, it just happens to be the case that in this kind of environment, this or that psychological mechanism didn't have the chance to express itself exactly the same way it expressed in other ways, right? And different localities and different contingencies are influential in that, but it's through and through the pan-human mental contents and organization, right? So you don't see in this kind of categorization any lack of continuity, right? There's no suddenly something cultural that like refutes the metaculture. The metaculture is always there. There's no cultural phenomenon that has any room in this analysis that um, just suddenly disappears or like gets refuted in any way. So there is consistency there. All of these evoked epidemiological, all of these other like expressions of culture are about expression and manifestations, not refutation or alternative behavior against the metaculture. Trent?
Yes, just very quick two reflections, I think. One, I think the whole table is kind of an invitation extended by this group to all the existing Kulturwissenschaftler out there. You can see like those who study, say, Goethe or specific Siberian shaman rituals would be categorized perhaps into those who study evoked culture. The specific cultural articulation, myths, stories mattered for human evolution, according to this group, because they help us to introduce, to enhance in-group solidarity and draw boundaries between in-groups and out-group, which were necessary for human survival and a certain without that the human beings would not modern human beings would not have been who we are today. So that's a really important part of our evolutionary history. Yes. And this, for those who study maybe communication, like media, whatever, they belong to the epidemiological culture group, like because what they're studying is really what made the spread of ideas, cultural symbols really important, possible at the first place. However, never forget both types of evoked and epidemiological culture was only possible. Differences could be articulated because they have the same pan-human metaculture mechanism, which bring human beings back to a common story that is connected with the long period of evolution. And so I think the first point I want to make is this is kind of an invitation towards the existing disciplines, provided that they accept one um, condition that is the culture, the locus of culture is in human mind. In the broadest way to put it, like it's a set of a cluster of the mechanisms, a psychological mechanism which developed in response to the pressure for selection in the environment, and that filtered possibilities and made what we observe in the world, the diverse cultural expressions, possible in the first place. So it's at the same time an invitation and also kind of consolidation of knowledge through the use of the concept of metaculture and such a tripartite categorization of cultural experiences in human societies. Yes.
I think there's an excellent point that you mentioned that I think is really kind of encapsulates something important. The locus of culture, or even we can say the locus of behavior,
Yeah.
is in human mind, right? And I think that's a very important element. Like as a mind, it's still, we're not sure how evolution psychologists think about the relation between mind and brain, but the locus is in this kind of individual like entity that is thrown out of like a womb, and it's just kind of like now it's there. We need to kind of study dash, right? That's the locus. And I think that also means that the point about like the cyber, like if you're an evolutionary psychologist and you go to Siberia and you try to study Siberians, I think the interesting question that evolutionary psychologists want you to ask is that how the exact same maintenance strategies like find their very weird, like uncanny expressions in this society, right? What kind of like strange rituals like this specific Siberian tribe have developed to do the exact same thing that people in New York City are doing, which is like filtering the status, right? And also, I think like they would also be interested and open to say that, hey, maybe like the Siberians have created a system that is actually gives those mechanisms have a better chance to express themselves, right? Instead of like trying to deny them, right? Um, or trying to stop them. The same way that we need some form of a space for our teeth to be drawn, right? Maybe we need a certain space to let those kind of like mating strategies to unfold. And I think that there is something that is going to be relevant for evolutionary psychologists of like how successful maybe different cultures have been contingently based on their conditions in like letting those kind of like mechanisms to actually and take shape. Um, that is going to be in some ways controversial in terms of like the impact of like the point about deviations and people not being able to do what evolution psychologists think is part of the meta culture. But we'll get that in the next episode. For now, I think we can move on to the concept of environment, which is also very important. And for evolution psychologists, again, the standard model thinks about environment as something that is non-biological in character, right? Environment is always cultural. Um, but for evolution psychologists, environment is first of all as much the product of evolution as the genes, right? Um, all the things, and that's why the environment itself is biological, no matter how much of a cultural cloak it wears. Like, it's just like the cultural element of the environment is just kind of maybe, yeah, just like the body is the same. The attire has changed, right? The environment cannot be anything extra biological or non-biological. Again, the point about consistency, right? And I think one very interesting thing that in evolutionary psychology that is important there is that environment is a mess. Like without like some form of like remember the point about language, right? The world is a mess. So when someone utters something, unless you kind of go there with certain constraints and certain framing strategies and certain like ideas of how to disregard certain things. You can never learn the language. You can never like understand that this is a word that is referring to an action. If you don't get rid of all sorts of noise and chaos, right? Environment is something like that too. Environment is itself kind of this extreme noise. So one of the things about these like pre-existing developmental plans is to kind of carve that space in the environment and in that sense create that environment that is the place that the developmental program can securely unfold, right? So this is a highly different, like a vastly different kind of way of thinking about cultural environment. Cultural environment is not a space to change us or determine us. Cultural environment is carving out a space based on pre-developmental mechanisms, pre-existing developmental mechanisms to carve something out of the space around us that does not have the extreme noisiness of environment in the broader sense of the word, right? And I think the example that they gave in the article was about like a pool table that is just like and a kind of a mad pool table. And like some holes are just like opening up and just fading away, and some are just like kind of waving, and the whole pool table is kind of like moving, in a weird way. And you are there to just take a shot. And there is like, 10% of that pool table uh that is stable, right? The whole is, um just kind of predictable. That part of the table is smooth, and the balls can easily move in them. And in that sense, the pre-existing developmental programs, they are designed to find that 10% of this pool table that is stable and set us there and let us unfold. That's the point about environment, right? Now, if we are thinking about the natural world as the environment, and then we think about the cultural environment as we are part of, the cultural environment is nothing but the carved out space in the natural environment in which our pre-existing development programs can securely unfold. This include teeth and successful reproduction in general, right? So cultural environment is not some magical thing that happens later on as like this kind of a non-biological entity that now suddenly determines who we are. Cultural environment is carved out natural space only to make it as secure as possible for us to unfold our developmental programs that are given to us psychologically in the form of adaptations. That's the environment. Sure.
Yes, I love what you said. It's very, very to the point. I think I want to second that with perhaps a more provocative summary of what I think is their definition of environment. I think according to them, environment is created by individual mind. Do you think that's a fair representation? Environment is not just the things outside mind, but things filtered by the mind and assigned with evolution and biological value too by the mind. Therefore, it's something exists for the sake of evolution.
Yes, I think that's accurate in the sense of I think the way that evolution psychologists are thinking about environment is not very different from the way that they're thinking about identifying utterance as a piece of like as a word in a language, right? Like environment is not a thing kind of like above us in a strange way. It's about a choice about which part of our surroundings we pick and which supporters we reject, and how that is not a random thing, right? How that choice is fundamentally informed by those basic psychological mechanisms that we have, right? So I think the environment that we find ourselves in is the result of the application of the psychological mechanisms in individual minds
Right.
applied to a fundamentally chaotic space, and now suddenly we have the environment.
Yes. So
In that sense, I agree with your assessment that this is about like this is kind of environment is as much in quote unquote mind as the psychological mechanism is in mind. They are like kind of intertwined. They're not
yes.
disjointed. That here's the cultural space, here's the natural like configuration of an individual body.
Yes, I will ask you the question because I want to add another question. Is asked it to compare this with perhaps the Hegel's idea of the relationship between self and the environment, the determination and constitution. It seems that it's very different in the sense that like Hegel would allocate independent to a, to a certain extent independent or autonomous agency to the environment, that it shapes like itself or individual in a way that this framework would not accommodate.
I think that's a very interesting observation. I think like the way that we can kind of frame that question is that what is the agency of the environment in determining what the individuals are,
Right.
right? And if you want to accept the fact that we are all as individuals carry these kind of pre-existing developmental programs that we're just like unfolding and we're trying to find a place. We're always looking for nests, metaphorically, right? We're always ready to give birth. We are looking for nests. That's all there is, right? Um, then the nest is not determining me, right? I'm carving out a nest because I am unfolding something, which is in this case, bearing a child, right? That has nothing to do with like the nest determining me. But um, any approach, and I think this is also an excellent way to kind of bring out, like the way that you mentioned it, to bring out something that this is not about culture, even. Right? Think about like an ecological thinker that thinks about environment as some sort of an autonomous system that really determines what the
Right.
mind is in the first place without appealing to any cultural element, just ecology as something that is really determining individuals. That's going to be at odds with this because this all kind of puts the directionality of environment creation from mind out. Mind, creation of environment. Mind is just like finding the nest in an inherently insecure space to bear a child. That's all there is. The nest doesn't have any autonomy of its own to just change the mind, right? I think that's a very interesting observation. Yeah.
Yes, and just a very quick comment, and we will move forward. If that crude oversimplification is not without foundation, I think they're much closer to uh, certain strand of Buddhist thinkers than to Hegel's or to even physicists to a certain extent that they because they could meaningfully analyze how the environment, the natural environment, the cosmos unfolds and develops like way before the existence of a human mind to that sense. And yes, the quick just very quickly the parallel I think is they're essentially given human mind a kind of cosmic value what certain Buddhist thinkers give to kind of enlightenment in the sense that we phenomena according to certain Mahayana traditions phenomena are created by mind like all phenomena and the world is nothing but impermanent strings of phenomena. And that's and mind what the mind does is to construct such a thing and confuses it and assigning them with ontological status but actually they do not have. So to achieve enlightenment is to realize mind is self-generating, environment is like a byproduct of mind. And so evolution and the progress towards enlightenment are essentially two pillars of among the Buddhist theorists and evolutionary psychologists. That they are the beginning and the end of the whole cosmic story, where we find a place for ourselves, because otherwise there's no security, no stability. We cannot make sense of things. But we must realize what really matters is not our individual, but that evolving mechanism behind. Like for Buddhism was the karma or independent generation, and for them it's also the biological reproduction, evolution, and in an evolutionary sense, the interpenetrating generation. So I think there's something really interesting there to consider this specific books group as, say, theorists of cosmos that are, or in comparison both with idealist philosophers like Hegel, and also with theorists of Buddhism. Yeah.
I think that's an excellent comparison. Yeah, and I think that could be explored further. I that was not on my radar, and I think that's an excellent idea, and how the Hegel and ecologists could be in the same camp, and evolutionary psychologists and Buddhists could be on a different camp. I think that's an excellent idea. Um, One last thing, it's very quick, and I don't have much to say about this, but it's just about the concept of learning. Because remember that for evolutionary psychologists, like these kind of the standard model is obsessed with like everything is learned through culture. But if we accept evolutionary psychologists' idea that everything is just this kind of unfolding of content specific information processes, mechanisms as adaptations, then learning, it's just a myth. Like we're basically kind of like, instead of giving a coherent causal story um of like, just like these links between adaptations and implementations of them in neurobiological machinery, we're just like we create this random like ether like concept. So I will read this, and then if you have any final thoughts, Trent, share with us, and then we can end this. Then they say, quote, we accept that the concept of learning will eventually disappear as cognitive psychologists and other researchers make progress in determining the actual causal sequence by which the functional business of the mind is transacted. Right.
Yes, I have nothing to add. I think their approach, their deconstruction approach towards learning is very much incongruent with their attitude towards environment and allocating the locus of culture essentially in individual mind. In that case, learning is a misidentified player in social culture making, in the sense that it's at the end of the day a process through which individual mind responds to um, the environment, which was filtered through the mind to begin with, and to construct a certain stable environment for individual development. So learning really does not have a category. It's not meaningful in the way we interpret the culture. To interpret the culture, we should look at the specific mechanisms in our mind and how they react to the environment. And learning just gets into the way, gets in the way, basically, in that sense.
Yes. And with that, we're gonna wrap this episode. In the next episode, like now we have the framework, now we have the approach, now we know what it stands up against. What we want to see is that like how this strategy, how this frame of reference as evolutionary psychology is gonna deal with possible discrepancies in human behavior, and how they identify them and how they try to make sense of them without abandoning the general premises, basic premises of evolution psychology. So until next time, take care. We will talk with you very soon.
Stay tuned. Our concrete examples of that will come up. See you next time.